The following podcast may contain triggering topics about the Indigenous peoples surrounding education and mental health. Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Unspoken. On today's episode, we will talk about the education problem in Indigenous communities.
So, occupants of Indigenous reserves often lack basic rights in Canada, and one of the most impactful is the education, as it heavily impacts the future generations.
It can affect their mental health as it does not help with their existing intergenerational trauma.
Why is the education on these reserves so bad compared to their counterparts in large urban cities?
Well, I feel like they are often provided with minimal resources and services. And to start, in some Indigenous reserves, occupants choose to speak their own Indigenous language rather than speak the official languages, which is English or French.
So what you're saying is they're teaching in languages that some don't fully understand?
Well, yeah, and because of their limited resources, they can find it difficult to fully utilize the education they are provided with.
So then why don't they just give them more resources so they can get an equitable education?
Because some reserves are difficult to travel to, especially if they're up north. You can only get to them in certain seasons and in limited transportation.
And with that, I think the government would rather spend their money on things that would help them gain, such as votes, rather than funding schools and helping the Indigenous education issue.
Well, I know there's something that I learned from the CBC website, which was a quote, and it was stating how it says that we have to be radical is what the person says, and Prime Minister Trudeau got elected, and a lot of First Nations voted for him based on him fixing the funding gap, and that they haven't seen any work done in dollars, and it's been a year and a half now, and we're sitting here waiting, and I know it takes a bit of time, but how much time do they need? So, like, Samir, what do you think about that?
I think it's bad, especially after the finding of the unmarked graves. Them still not doing anything for education and for many reserves in Canada, I think is poor from the government, and I think the voters may need to rethink their choices in the upcoming election.
Yeah, and to add on, we should vote for someone who would care for the current issues, such as the lack of resources, effort, and acknowledgement towards Indigenous people, more specifically their education, that will help the children get a sustainable and helpful education. With that being said, do you guys think the education gap is a huge problem in the eyes of the government?
I don't. I think it is a minuscule problem on the large agenda of things for the government, because they have provided them with minimal services, but these services cannot be used to their full potential due to the curriculum that is provided to the children.
Yeah, adding on to you, I was reading and it said that according to a new report that the education gap averages at 30%. And not only that, the curriculum is not ideal for the Indigenous students as is told by the perspective of the colonizer.
Exactly, and I think that's not good because they kind of lose the identity of who they are and what their culture is and how important the Indigenous people of Canada really were. You can even see this in the US, where you see stories about the people who traveled there and discovered America when they really didn't.
Yeah, they're losing their identities of themselves, their culture and history, and also how they have been racially discriminated against does not help, as well as how they have been ignored by the government.
Yeah, adding on to that, Indigenous children are always likely to arrive at school hungry, ill, and even tired. And they're often bullied, and this is like a corporal punishment, and it's still widespread. And not even that, Indigenous girls in particular experience difficult problems related to unfriendly school environments, gender discrimination, school-based violence, and sometimes even sexual abuse, and this all would contribute to their high dropout rates in the reserves.
Yeah, this heavily affected the reserves for the Indigenous as new laws were enforced against them that they were obviously obligated to follow no matter the situation, as the government has the authority over the Aboriginal peoples.
Exactly, and I think if this was in a big city, in a non-Indigenous community, the government would have made a change a long time ago, because the education problem in Indigenous reserves have been going on for such a long time, and it's really ridiculous how long it's taken them to even talk about it.
Yeah, as you said, in the big cities, the problem would have been solved by now as the amount of people that would have complained to them. But to properly integrate Aboriginal peoples into the Euro-Canadian civilization, their cultures, languages, customs, and overall their sense for themselves have to be brought into their daily life and schools for them to get their sense for themselves and for their life.
Before contact with the Europeans, the Indigenous people educated their youth through traditional means. So this would mean like group socialization, participation in cultural and spiritual rituals, skill development, and even oral teachings.
Yeah, also, there isn't enough Indigenous representation in education in Canada in subjects such as art, music, and also mainly history, which mainly focuses on the World War and the European point of view. And they don't go into depth at all about any Indigenous issues or how they're facing discrimination, or especially the Indigenous education issue, which is what we're talking about right now.
Exactly, and like you said, in World War One, the Indigenous people of Canada were very crucial to the aid of Great Britain. We even saw this in the American Revolution, where Canadian and American Indigenous people helped the American troops defeat the British.
Yeah, it also doesn't help the fact that we as students are all learning this in-depth information about Indigenous and Aboriginal people now, and not as in elementary. As in elementary, we didn't go in depth at all. We just barely scratched the surface on the real issue.
Yeah, I feel like in elementary we were mostly talked about residential schools, and that was a very severe topic that we were talking in such young age. And I feel like we could have learned about this much earlier, as it isn't that traumatizing to learn about.
Yeah, and this has been an ongoing problem since when we were in elementary. It's not just a now problem, so yeah, we should have learned earlier.
Yeah.
And even in elementary, when we were learning about a little bit of what was going on, they kept repeating the same things and sort of keeping us on a narrow road without going in depth and explaining, like you guys said.
Yeah, every year would be the same repetitive topics all over again.
Yeah.
Exactly, and in elementary school, I feel like we didn't learn it as much because we didn't see Indigenous people in the media very often.
Mm-hmm.
But now that we have more stories coming out, like the unmarked graves that were found, I feel like the government's trying to cover their tracks and give us a class to show that they care about the Indigenous people when they aren't doing much for them.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I'm going to bring up the Ryerson University, how they changed their name. They changed their name to Toronto Metropolitan University, as one of the school board's directors was a key part in the introduction and expansion of residential schools. And due to that, obviously it brought up concerns with the institution. So as the links to the Canadian residential schools, everyone wanted the name change. So yeah.
And I think that's the main reason why we chose to focus on this specific problem in our podcast, because we really don't see anything being done by the government. And I feel like us being the future generation, we need to take the step and make sure that this word gets across. Like, I know there's a quote by Mahatma Gandhi saying, we need to be the change that we wish to see in the world. And I truly live by that. And therefore, this is why we need to get this word across to the public.
Yeah, exactly. And back to what we all said, our findings of the lack of resources, effort, acknowledgement, generally towards the Indigenous people, more specifically the education, we need to get, as you said, the word across to the media, to everyone. And as the government only displays effort in the media, but doesn't actually take any action to solve the problem is still reoccurring and will continue to reoccur, which is also why we are talking about this today, to inform others about the education issue and the general issue with Indigenous mistreatment.
Exactly, and informing others is key because I don't think many people realize how severe the issue of education in Indigenous communities are. Because not only is it the education which the Indigenous people are suffering from, it's the gateway that it brings to other issues like mental health. When they have to move away to just get a basic education, it can really put a strain on them.
Not only that, but I feel like we're very fortunate to be having the access to education and not having to leave our identity behind to get a basic right which should be given to everyone. And I feel like not many people know that. And that's why we need to be able to educate others, because we're lucky enough to know what's going on. And for those who don't, I feel like if they do know what's going on, more steps would be taken to alleviate this problem.
Exactly, and most people think that the lack of education is in other less developed countries, but they don't really realize that even here in Canada that this can be a big problem for some people.
Yeah, exactly. And with that, thank you for listening to our podcast on Indigenous education. Hope you enjoyed. Come back next week and join us for our talk on Texas shooting and the mass gun law issue in the world.